Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. This edition is published in the early hours of Monday, the 31st of October. The left-wing populist Luis Inácio Lula da Silva has been declared winner of the Brazilian presidential election, narrowly beating the far-right incumbent Jair Bolsonaro. At least 80 people have died in India after a bridge collapsed in Gujarat. And students in Iran defy an ultimatum from the authorities and continue their protests. Also in the podcast, Somalia reels from a double bomb attack by al-Shabaab.
So far, the number of people who have died has reached 100, and 300 are wounded.
Why French champagne companies are buying land in southern England. And why trick or treat for Halloween when you can do this?
The most recent gravestone that I've come across is one in Maine, and it literally has the recipe for ice cream, and then right underneath it says, "I love to cook."
The woman who collects recipes from tombstones. Judging by the extremely close outcome of the presidential election, Brazil appears to be a nation divided. In the first hour or so after the polls shut, the far-right incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro took a narrow lead over his bitter rival, the left-wing populist and former President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. But as the count progressed, the margin started to shrink, and eventually the challenger took the lead. As we record this podcast, Lula looks set to win, with 50.8% of the vote against 49.2% for Jair Bolsonaro. The Global News podcast's Nick Miles is in Barra in Rio, and he joins us now. Nick, what are you seeing there?
Ollie, well, I am just seeing in front of me on a screen that Lula has been elected as the next president with 50.83% of the vote. Jair Bolsonaro is 49.17. This is officially on the Globo.com website, Globo being a big media player here in Brazil. So they are calling it. It's not coming from the electoral authorities themselves. That is the latest we are seeing.
I'm seeing pictures of what must be Lula supporters celebrating, and it sounds like they're beginning to do so where you are.
Well, it's hard to tell, to be honest, because this is a Bolsonaro supporting area. The fireworks have been going on over the last hour and a half. We were presuming that they were Bolsonaro supporters, but as you can hear, there are horns blaring, so it's quite possible. A few people have been coming through, Lula supporters, in cars over the last half an hour or so, hooting their horns. So certainly some degree of mixing between the Bolsonaro supporters and the Lula supporters over the last hour, at least.
Such a tight race. What does this mean for Brazil going forward?
It is going to be extremely difficult. I've just been speaking to a number of Bolsonaro supporters here in this bar. They are dejected, they're shell-shocked, but they are accepting the result, and they hope that Jair Bolsonaro accepts it too. There was a lot of concern that he wouldn't, and that might lead to his supporters going out onto the streets and protesting. There is no problem with electoral fraud, according to a number of Bolsonaro supporters I've been speaking to. They accept the result and they want Brazil to move forwards now. But how that happens is really, really hard to tell. It's going to be very difficult for Lula da Silva to push things forward now. The economy is in dire straits, particularly after the pandemic. Since then, Jair Bolsonaro has spent an awful lot on the most poor sections of Brazilian society. Over the last few months he did, and many people saw that as a vote-winning measure. Now the country is in dire straits economically, and Lula really needs to have a boost to the economy so that all sides of Brazilian society can say, yeah, we are better off now under Lula. We disagree about so many things, cultural agenda being one of them, whether or not you carry guns, all sorts of issues over the Amazon rainforest, whether or not you develop it or protect it. There are many issues that divide people. If the economy was going well, I think perhaps people would come together, but that is a big if.
Nick Miles, live in Rio. as the official result comes through that Lula has won the presidential election in Brazil. A footbridge built during the British colonial era in India has collapsed, plunging hundreds of people into the river below. Around 80 people are reported to have died. The suspension bridge in Gujarat reopened just 5 days ago after a 6-month refurbishment. Footage from before the collapse showed a large crowd moving from side to side as the bridge swayed, with one person even kicking a cable. After the structure came down, survivors swam to the shore or tried to climb up the wreckage to get out of the water. I heard more about what happened from our India correspondent, Yogita Lamai.
The first responders were local police and people who lived in the area. The bridge itself wasn't very long, just about a quarter of a kilometre. So in the video footage filmed by onlookers, you can see that people are swimming to either shore, but you can also see people actually clinging on to the cables and the net, which was on the side of the bridge, trying to stay afloat. We've been told by the regional government minister that among the dead, there are women, children, and elderly people. The rescue operation is really being conducted in the darkness of the night, so it will take some time for the true scale of the tragedy to become clear.
Yeah, looking at the images from the scene, it is quite incredible. The river's quite far below where the bridge was, so those people would have fallen quite some distance. And yet, as you say, there were many people alive trying to climb back up the bridge to get to safety.
That's right. One of the things we are being told by local authorities is that there was overcrowding on the bridge. It's been the week of Diwali festivities here in India. So it's been a time when schools have been off. So families have been on vacation. And this particular bridge, locally called Julta Pool, or which literally translated means a hanging bridge, is a sort of a tourist attraction in this particular town of Morbi in the west of the Gujarat state.
And of course, only recently reopened after that refurbishment. So there will be questions for the authorities to answer. And this is, of course, the home state of the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi.
That's right. And the Prime Minister has said he's spoken to the regional minister of Gujarat. He's also announced compensation for the people who've died and who've been injured in this incident. But yes, we've been told that an investigation will take place, specifically about under what circumstances was it reopened, who certified that, if it was renovated for 6 months, what really happened this evening that it collapsed. And if there was overcrowding, then why weren't there civic officials in the area? Why weren't there instructions in the area to ensure that that didn't happen?
Yogita Lamai talking to me from Mumbai. Police in South Korea are trying to establish exactly what caused the crush that killed more than 150 people celebrating Halloween in Seoul. The authorities say they've identified nearly all those who died. A period of national mourning has been declared. Jean McKenzie in Seoul reports on the aftermath of one of the deadliest accidents in South Korea's recent history.
This is the moment the partying turned to panic. Don't push, it hurts, people shout. Thousands had packed into a popular alleyway filled with bars, which became so crowded people were crushed to death.
Waves are coming in from both sides, and more people fell, and then I lost my friend. And I had to turn around and I told the crowd, you can't come this way. People are dying.
Most of the victims are in their teens or 20s.
I didn't sleep till now. Couldn't sleep because I see people dying in front of me.
Nuil Ahmed was in the alleyway. He managed to climb onto a ledge where he watched the horrific scenes play out.
At first, someone pushed from the back quite a few times. Then I realized something's going to happen because there's no way you can breathe. So everyone lifting up and that's what they're doing, taking their last breath, kind of suffocating.
At a nearby community centre, families are coming to register their missing loved ones. This is where they find out whether they're on the list of those known to have died. Some received the terrible news their relatives' names are among the dead. For others, there's no information. This is almost as hard to hear. This woman's son went to work at a club in Itaewon last night. She hasn't heard from him since.
I called his number, but he's not going to. He's the only son. He's only one I have.
Visiting the scene, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol said he too was struggling to process the grief. Something that should never have happened, he said. There are questions he'll have to answer. How was this crowd size allowed to get so out of control? And what could have stopped this tragedy? But for now, this country is mourning the death of so many of its young.
Jean Mackenzie reporting from Seoul. The British government is being urged to open an investigation into claims that the phone of the former Prime Minister Liz Truss was hacked back when she was Foreign Secretary. The Mail on Sunday newspaper reported that private messages, including some about the war in Ukraine, fell into foreign hands. It said Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, ordered the story to be kept out of the public domain. Peter Ricketts is a former chief diplomat at the British Foreign Office and was the UK's first national security advisor. James Kumarasamy asked him what he made of this revelation.
I think it reinforces the only strong point that you can make to ministers, which is that if you use a mobile phone, you can't be sure that others aren't listening. Because we've had this before. Ministers, of course, like all the rest of us, use their mobile phones for all kinds of personal contact. But if you're talking about official information, anything that might be classified, you've got to be really careful because you can't be sure that there won't be somebody listening out there. As I understand it, ministers have an official phone which will have more security features on it. But even so, as I gather, you can't be certain that foreign intelligence agencies aren't hacking it. But I don't think there's any mobile device you can be certain that you could discuss confidential matters and be sure it stays classified.
And the fact that this has only come out now, is that in any way surprising?
Yes, we're a bit unclear, I think, aren't we, as to how it came out, how people discovered that it was going on. We understand it was during her leadership campaign. As often with these things, there's the story of what the actual action was initially, and then how it was dealt with in government and why it was held back, and there seems to have been this news blackout. I don't understand the reason for that. That's another set of questions that need to be answered. But I think this Liz Truss episode and the fact that apparently foreign agents were listening to what was passing, is a very, very sharp wake-up call, I think, to all ministers.
When these kind of listening in episodes have come out in the past, has it led to change in behaviour?
I can't honestly say that it has. I'm not quite sure that there's any magic solution to this.
But presumably, when it comes to espionage, especially at a time of war like this, we, the West, is doing something similar to the other side.
I'm long enough out of power that I don't know. One imagines so. But it is all the more important for ministers when they are talking about issues of war and peace and anything connected with that to be very, very conscious of the risks.
Peter Ricketts talking to James Kumarasamy. Earlier this month, the US made big changes into how it trades with China. The aim? To prevent China from getting the latest, most powerful microchips and other items that could be used in the development of weapons or artificial intelligence. Some in Washington are billing it as a defining moment in America's face-off with China. The changes could have a significant impact on Taiwan, though, as Mark Urban explains.
Getting access to Taiwan's high-tech sector isn't easy. For one thing, the fabs or fabrication plants are chock full of trade secrets, keys to how Taiwan has gained such a dominant place in this global industry. And for another, there's been COVID. So what we can see in this factory in Taiwan, Global Wafers, is the way that silicon is grown in crystalline form in columns, which are then sliced into circular wafers. The largest of these about a foot across, and each one of these will then produce many, many integrated circuits or microchips. And all aspects of this production are done to such high levels, such high tolerances in Taiwan, that they've managed to corner the global market, and they've got 90% of the world's finest microchips being made in this country, which is both an extraordinary blessing in terms of the economic effects that it creates, the ancillary industries that it supports, but it also makes some people worry whether it makes Taiwan even more of a target as America and China contest the future of global technology. In China, the authorities have already been consulting with chip makers about how to respond to the new American controls. Some of those we've spoken to in the Taiwanese industry argue that the restrictions may backfire in that, barred from outside suppliers, the Chinese may be spurred to develop these new technologies for themselves.
This is the product out of the crystal cooler. You can slice into 2,000 of wafer.
Just very thin slices all the way through.
Yeah.
But you're already feeling the effect of
Yes.
the new US regulations.
We have to follow immediately.
But the techniques used to make wafers of such high purity or etch chips just a few atoms thick are not easily copied, and China has been trying to do so already with mixed results. So others in Taiwan support the new American measures to prevent China growing into a real monster.
The future of the chip industry is going to be made in America.
While the effects of the new American rules will take some time to become clear, the intent behind them makes this a defining moment in the strategic competition between the world's biggest economic and military powers.
Mark Urban reporting from Taiwan. And still to come on the Global News podcast.
We don't know where we got infected from. We are living in a state of panic, worried that we catch it from the air we breathe.
Its economy is broken, and now Lebanon is hit by a cholera outbreak. 5 years after Islamist militants from Al-Shabaab exploded a truck bomb outside Somalia's education ministry, killing 500 people, it looks like the group has struck again at the same junction. Al-Shabaab said it carried out Saturday's twin car bombings in the capital, Mogadishu. The Somali president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, said many lives had been lost.
So far, the number of people who have died has reached 100, and 300 are wounded. The number for both the dead and wounded continues to increase. Somali people are recuperating from the attacks 5 years ago in the same area. Some of them recovered from the injuries, some were disabled, some were orphans who lost relatives in previous attacks.
Dr. Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor is a lecturer at the University of Mogadishu and lives about 1.5 kilometres from where the devices exploded.
I felt the impact from my house, and then my house was quite shaking. So since I was living in Mogadishu for the last 7 years, I knew that was the very, very, very huge. And then suddenly, after a few minutes, the second wave came again, and then the same feeling of shake to my home, and the damage was very high. The bodies were everywhere, the crying people was everywhere, the destruction was everywhere. I felt really very, 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 very painful.
Our reporter in neighbouring Kenya, Richard Kago, has been talking to my colleague Andrew Peach.
Staff are working at the country's Ministry of Education, and those are largely the people who died during the twin explosions that took place Saturday afternoon. When this was happening, the state was really a hive of activity because there's a lot of trading that does take place just along this particular street in Mogadishu.
And as we've been hearing from the President, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, attacks like this in Somalia are all too common.
Yes, but looking at the death toll that we have so far, more than 100 died and 300 injured. So then this points to, a big attack, and possibly could be then a statement that the Al-Shabaab militants possibly could be sending to the government, because the government had stepped up the attacks with the aim of defeating the group in the last couple of months.
And for listeners who are new to this, who are Al-Shabaab and what are they trying to achieve?
This is a militant group that is allied to the Al-Qaeda group, and they came together around 2007. So their agenda has always been to topple the government that was installed in 2011. They have been really stepping up attacks against the government with the aim of destabilizing it, because this is the internationally recognized government. The Al-Shabaab have always wanted to impose their own version of Sharia law.
And there must be concerns now that there'll be a wave of attacks of this sort, not that anyone can do a huge amount to prevent them.
Yes, we've been seeing pockets of attacks that have been happening, the latest having been in the port city of Kismayu, which is about hundreds of kilometers south of the capital, Mogadishu, happening slightly over a week ago. What we have seen is that the government, together with groups which are pro-government, as well as with the backing of the Africa Mission in Somalia, they have been, wiping and trying to defeat the Al-Shabaab, specifically in the central region of Somalia and in the southern parts of the country. Yeah, so there has been concern that probably they might just attempt to retaliate, and in this case, the people who are going to be the victims or the casualties have been the ordinary civilians who have been caught up in this conflict.
Richard Kago in Nairobi. The authorities in Iran are doubling down on their demands that students end their demonstrations over the death of a young woman in police custody. President Ibrahim Raisi said the nation's security is a red line that shouldn't be crossed. However, protests have continued, with online footage showing clashes on a number of university campuses. On Sunday, more than 300 Iranian journalists called for the release of 2 jailed colleagues. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, has the latest.
This video posted on social media shows a violent confrontation at Tehran's Azad University. Paramilitary Basij forces attack students with tear gas and sticks. Other videos indicate there have also been clashes on other campuses today, with students shouting, "Dishonored Basij, get lost," an insult directed at the militia belonging to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Yesterday, the Corps commander, Hussein Salami, issued his strongest warning to protesters yet. Do not come to the streets, he declared. Today is the last day of the riots. He condemned what he called a sinister plan hatched in the White House and the Zionist regime, the same accusation repeatedly voiced by senior clergy against the US and Israel. In another sign of an intensifying crackdown, the authorities have now released details of charges against protesters which carry the death penalty. There's no sign this unprecedented defiance has run out of steam.
Lise Doucette reporting. The Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, has left the presidential palace a day before his 6-year term comes to an end, and he has no designated successor. The country is already suffering a deep economic crisis. The currency's lost around 90% of its value since 2019, and more than 80% of the population is living in poverty. Mr. Aoun said Lebanon had been looted and badly needed to root out corruption.
Now we will move to the second phase. It will be very difficult because there is no way for us to relax before we end this suffering that was imposed on us. We need to lift the country out of the crisis that my rivals plunged us in.
But on top of its political and economic problems, Lebanon is now suffering from a cholera outbreak for the first time in decades. It joins a growing list of nations, 29 at the latest count, affected by a disease spread mostly by unclean water. This report from our Lebanon correspondent, Anna Foster.
Mira has cholera. She's just 18 months old, and the hydration drip she's attached to should help her survive. There hadn't been a cholera case in Lebanon for 30 years, but now, as the country collapses, it's back. There have been hundreds of suspected cases in just a few weeks, but because there aren't simple diagnostic tests, the true figure could be thousands. Mohammed Akel arrived here at the emergency ward of the Abdallah El Rassi Public Hospital a few hours ago.
My whole body aches. I can't eat or drink. I have chills and a fever. If I tried to drink anything, it would go straight through me.
Mohammed blames incompetent politicians for the outbreak, as Lebanon's public services, water and sanitation systems have broken down. The Ministry of Health promises vaccines are coming, but the hospital's director, Dr. Mohammed Khadrin, fears they'll be overwhelmed before they arrive.
We can't cater for all cases because of limited capacity. After all, it is a small hospital for a big area, and cases are increasing. So if the problem is not contained, we won't be able to cope.
The outbreak is now spreading across the country and has even been detected in wastewater in the capital, Beirut. Many of the cases we saw in hospital are from the town of Bebnin in the north. The water here is brown and completely opaque. You can't see into it at all, and it cuts a channel through these houses. It runs so closely to where people are washing and eating, to where children are playing, and rubbish goes into this water, and then it comes out to do things like irrigate the crops. And that is why a place like this helps cholera to spread so very easily. Lebanon's lack of electricity makes it hard to pump fresh water, so often dirty water is all families can get. It's regularly used for crops, and when new shoots are planted here in a few days, they'll be fed from the polluted stream. But Ahmed tells me they have no choice.
Of course I'm worried. My brother had cholera, and a number of our neighbors have died from it, including a young man just today. We try to avoid it, but we don't always have a choice.
Now, like the outbreak, fear is starting to spread. Hussein's brother Hassan died from cholera 3 days ago. Normally, hundreds of people would come to pay their respects, but there've been hardly any. They're scared of catching it too.
We don't know where we got infected from. We are living in a state of panic, worried that we catch it from the air we breathe. We are afraid of everything now.
Cholera is transmitted through unclean water, not the air, and the government is trying to spread awareness. Cases in Lebanon are growing daily, and the problems causing it are so big they're hard to fix. But until there are major improvements to the country's infrastructure, it's difficult to see how this outbreak can be brought under control.
Anna Foster in Lebanon. Climate change and warmer summers are having an impact on winemaking in Europe. French champagne houses are reported to be buying up thousands of hectares of land in the south of England over fears that parts of France are becoming too hot to grow vines. Richard Hamilton has the details.
Temperatures are rising relentlessly across Europe. This year, for example, Portugal hit a new record of 47 degrees Celsius. The optimum temperature for grapevines is thought to be between 25 and 32 degrees. English winemakers say they're now experiencing the same type of climatic conditions that were common in the Champagne region in northeastern France 50 years ago. It also means British companies can grow grape varieties such as Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Riesling that were previously impossible, and production is expected to increase exponentially over the coming decades. The industry body WineGB says 8.7 million vines have been planted in the UK in the last 5 years, and that sales of vines have risen by nearly 70%. Its chief executive, Simon Thorpe, says this is good news for Britain, but it does present a new set of problems.
The challenge that climate change has brought for producers in warmer areas, so effectively anywhere south of where we are here in this country, is becoming very troublesome and problematic. Droughts, high temperatures, we see reports of forest fires or wildfires, and these things are changing the shape of viticulture and winemaking in Europe and around the world, actually. So the temperature rise is certainly a positive, but it does also bring some challenges with regards to sort of extra moisture in the summer. But then if we get a frost in May, then that can be very damaging. So it's not entirely good.
So far, 3 major continental investors have bought up land in England, the champagne producers Taittinger and Pommery, and the German wine manufacturer Henkel. It's likely that other companies will follow in their footsteps. As champagne can only be labelled as such if it actually originates from that region, there may also be logistical and legal challenges in the increasingly warm years ahead.
Richard Hamilton. The period starting at Halloween is traditionally a time to remember the dead. But one woman in the US has been visiting graves to collect recipes inscribed on tombstones. Rosie Grant at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles has been telling Paul Henley how her hobby started.
So I was interning at a cemetery in Washington, D.C. in their digital archives. And I was just kind of looking up different recipes. I had a TikTok account that I was talking about this internship and just different parts of cemetery the world around that I was learning. And so I heard about the Spritz cookie grave that's based in Brooklyn, New York, kind of just in that whole process. And so it's the grave of Naomi Miller Dawson. It's this beautiful open book. And so I first saw it online on Atlas Obscura, and then a few different like news reports specifically about this grave. And so I cooked it and I posted it on TikTok.
And you ended up finding loads more recipes, almost all of them for sweet things, biscuits and cakes. Why?
That's been the most interesting thing. They've been almost all women and almost all baked goods and desserts. It seems like for most of these recipes, it wasn't part of like a larger trend. They were doing this individually. A few family members that I've either talked to or read interviews from have mentioned, well, we loved how she made these. She was so proud of making these particular recipes. She would bring them to family gatherings and holidays and birthdays. And so it was just the precious family recipe that they decided to memorialize, which so happened to be desserts.
And what is their philosophy, the family's philosophy, at choosing to leave this part of a person behind so obviously?
In the States, at least, it's been part of a larger trend of very personalized graves. You know, in the olden days, you think of like just your name, maybe a death date, or like a spiritual quote or symbol. And these days, it's the sky's the limit and what people put on their gravestone. It might be hobbies or just things that are really important to them. So I think for these women in particular, they loved cooking. They were very hospitable. They would host big family gatherings. Even the most recent gravestone that I've come across is one in Maine, and it literally has the recipe for ice cream, and then right underneath it says, "I love to cook."
Digital librarian Rosie Grant. And that is all from us for now, but the Global News podcast will be back very soon. This edition was mixed by Russell Newlove and produced by Emma Joseph. Our editor is Karen Martin. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.